Welcome, everyone. I'm glad to see a lot of people joining us today for this event with REAL. My name is Maya Persson, and I'm the advisor for knowledge management and communication, supporting the REAL Award for Save the Children. I'm happy to co-host this event with Jill Scantlin, who is the Resilience Monitoring and Evaluation Research and Learning Advisor, supporting the REAL Award from Mercy Corps. Jill will be co-presenting and moderating today's discussion. Before we start, I'd like to go through some important practical instructions. If we can go to the next slide, please. We are providing simultaneous interpretation to French during this event. So for this to work best, I'd like to ask all of you to choose your preferred language. So if you prefer French or English, please go to the bottom of your Zoom screen. There's a little icon that looks like a globe. Click it and then choose either English or French. So if you don't choose any language, you'll only hear the original language. So if there would be a question posed in French, you won't hear it being translated into English. So please just click on the globe, select English or French. The PowerPoint that we're using today is available in French. We have done a sort of a draft automatic translation of that. Please follow the link in the chat to access the PowerPoint in French. That we will finalize that translation after the webinar and send it out to everybody, so you have that accessible. And we are recording today's event both in English and French, so we'll share those recordings with you all after. After choosing your language, please fill out the poll that you should see on your screen as you're joining. So do fill out that poll. And lastly, please introduce yourself in the chat box so we can get a sense of who is in the room. For those of you who are not familiar with REAL, Resilience Evaluation Analysis and Learning Award, it's a consortium-led effort funded by the USAID Center for Resilience. It was established to respond to the growing demand among USAID missions, host governments, implementing organizations, and other key stakeholders for rigorous yet practical monitoring, evaluation, strategic analysis, and capacity building support related to resilience. REAL is implemented by Save the Children, Food for the Hungry, Mercy Corps, and TANGO International. You can learn more about REAL on our webpage, fsnnetwork.org/real. Today's webinar builds on the 6th guidance note in our series of resilience measurement practical guidance notes that you see on this slide. In this series that currently has 7 guidance notes, we synthesize existing technical documents into pragmatic guidance to assist practitioners in integrating core aspects of resilience measurement into their program assessments, design, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. In 7 parts, the series introduces key concepts and guides practitioners through the process of resilience measurement. You can access all of these notes on the FSN network. Before I hand over to Jill, I quickly wanted to let those of you who joined a little bit late, because I see people are still coming into the room, so welcome. We're already in the introduction part of this webinar. Those of you who just joined, if we can go back to the previous slide, I just wanted to show you that we have simultaneous interpretation. So please go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and pick your language if you want French or English. Then fill out the poll that you see on the screen. And lastly, please introduce yourselves in the chat so we get a sense of who's in the room. And if you have any tech issues at all, just reach out to me or to Zubaida, my colleague, in the chat. And I think with that, we have already the results from the poll. So I think I will hand over to you, Jill, to comment on those poll results, if we can pull those up Zubaida.
Okay, Thanks, Maya. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Like Maya said, I'm Jill Scantlin, and I'm the Resilience Measurement Advisor working for Mercy Corps and one of the authors of the guidance note. So let me just see here in the poll. We got these questions, or excuse me, the response options from the question we posed during registration about what you wanted to get out of this webinar. And so it looks like we have two of the categories that are leading the pack here. So practical steps in developing and implementing RMS from a practitioner's perspective, and integrating RMS into the M&E system, applying learnings to adaptively manage programs. Those seem to be leading the pack with what we want to get out of the webinar, which is great because we're definitely going to cover these things specifically in the case studies that we're going to present today. And so that's great that that's what we want to hear. We also have opportunity added value tools, costs of implementing recurring monitoring surveys. I know Arno Bratz, who's one of our speakers, is going to touch a bit on some of the costs. So we'll be talking about that. And last but not least, learning around designing and implementing surveys in the virtual world. Interest in that, we may touch on that, but feel free to add specific questions around that area in the Q&A, and I think Arno and Tim will both be able to speak to that as well. So thanks everyone for replying to the poll. All right, next slide. Zubaida, please. Okay, so Guidance Note 6 was published in October 2019, but since then, there's been a lot of learning about what works with implementing recurrent monitoring surveys. So the REAL team thought that we would sort of relaunch this guidance note through this webinar series and be able to bring back some folks that worked on it previously, but also to bring other folks that have been kind of innovating in the space to talk about their insights into implementing recurrent monitoring surveys. And so we'll be presenting two case studies about those practical implementation focused information. But before we get into that, I wanted to just go over sort of what is in the guidance note, what's covered in the guidance note, and then really what isn't covered in the guidance note. And I would really encourage everyone here to read it. And I know we recently published it in French, so we have those multiple language options. And at some point, and it looks like the guidance note series link has been pasted into the chat. So please take a look at that if you haven't already. So it's in the guidance note. So we cover what is an RMS or recurrent monitoring survey. How is it different from typical program monitoring? A lot of people ask that question. So it lays it out in the guidance note pretty clearly. Some of the decision making around determining whether to deploy an RMS in your program, some considerations, some to think through there. Recurrent monitoring models and examples of those models. So we lay out the kind of different types of recurrent monitoring and some clear examples of when it might be appropriate to do model 1 versus model 2. Methodological considerations for designing an RMS, and then a bit about planning and budgeting for an RMS. So what the guidance note doesn't cover, so it doesn't have a step-by-step process or protocol for conducting an RMS, and it doesn't really cover any of the analysis. So I would really, again, encourage everyone to read it. It's pretty comprehensive. The next slide, Zubaida, please. So what's different about recurrent monitoring surveys from regular monitoring? Again, this is a question that people ask me kind of over and over again, and there are quite a few differences, but the four main differences I would say are that recurrent monitoring really occurs around shocks and stresses. So you plan them around when those shocks and stresses are happening, which is sort of different than regular monitoring. They're triggered by a shock, or they're given at certain times of the year. We'll get into kind of more information around that. But again, it's sort of you're planning these surveys around different shocks and stresses to try to see how individuals and households respond to those shocks and stresses and how this affects their well-being over time. That's really the focus of these surveys. We also typically follow the same households over time in recurrent monitoring surveys. So having a panel data approach, which is different than I think typical monitoring. Next slide, please. So I kind of alluded to these different models of recurrent monitoring surveys. There's typically just two main types of models that you would use in a recurrent monitoring survey. So the first is designed around when a shock happens. So it's going to be triggered by a particular indicator that you're going to be monitoring. And so, for example, it could be rainfall. It could be maybe an indicator or that you're monitoring around violent incidences. But essentially, that with this model, the recurrent monitoring is triggered by that specific indicator when a threshold is reached. And so you'll identify those shocks in advance, and you'll identify your indicators in advance, and you'll be kind of monitoring those through context monitoring. And it's important to use both the national and local data sources to be able to monitor these different indicators. You want to have the localized information because sometimes it's going to be different than the national level information. I know that Tim's going to talk about this a little bit. But really a distinguishing factor with this model is that you kind of are waiting for a shock to happen, and then you have an indicator to tell you whether it's happened or not. The application for this model, there's many, but I think what makes it sort of unique is that you can use it to sort of advocate for triggering a crisis modifier, for example. If you're able to show that there's some, a lot of the participants that you're working with are coping or are not coping with a shock or stress, it might be able to be the moment where you can advocate for that crisis modifier. It also has a lot of adaptive management applications inside it, kind of other applications that would be applicable for your program. So please, next slide, please, Zubaida. So the second type of recurrent monitoring model is a little bit different. It's focused around different seasons of the year or different times of the year where you know people are kind of feeling the shocks and stresses a bit more. So for example, typically we will do these around rainy and dry seasons or maybe post-harvest and lean seasons. And one of the values of this type of RMS model is that you're able to capture some of those idiosyncratic shocks. So these are the types of shocks that will be different household to household within a community. So these are deployed, typically at regular intervals, and they might be once, twice, 3 times a year. One of the applications for this type of model and one of the strengths is that and you can really easily embed this into your annual surveys or those typical surveys that you have that are kind of pre-planned. Okay, next slide, please. And so within any given context, there's going to be multiple, sometimes interrelated shocks and stresses that are occurring at once. And so when you're determining how to design your RMS, I think it's important to consider, the different shock contexts and scenarios that are going on in order to kind of pick the type of RMS that's going to work best for you. And so this slide just shows a table that might be helpful, and it's in the guidance note. Some criteria to think about when you're thinking about your shock and stress scenarios and which RMS is going to work better for you. So we have a couple of considerations. The primary considerations really are the speed at which the shock and stress occurs. And so is it rapid or acute, or is it a slow onset, a chronic shock? Thank you for muting. And then the other consideration is, the proportion of the population that it's going to affect. So is it a large proportion of the population? Is it a large covariate shock, or maybe it's more idiosyncratic, so just affecting maybe some or a few households in the community? And so one example of this, maybe we can look at the bottom left, is from the PRIME project that they were trying to design an RMS around the most prevalent shock that occurs in that area, so drought. And so at the time, the PRIME project had a comprehensive baseline that they set up, and they were monitoring for drought through rainfall data, and they were decided to deploy an RMS once signs that the rains had failed. And so that was the first model of the RMS, triggered by a different shock or stress, and it affected around 90% of the population. So they decided that being able to conduct 2 rounds of the RMS around this first model where it was triggered by a drought, by following up with a smaller subset of individuals, was a good way to complete this RMS. Another example would be maybe in a different context where there's multiple shocks and stresses happening at once, and they're happening seasonally, maybe in northern Bangladesh, and they want to understand the differences that are occurring between households over time. They might choose an RMS where you're planning those around those different rainy and dry seasons. So these are just some examples of kind of the decisions that you have to go through and think about when you're designing an RMS. And again, the guidance note kind of goes through some of these in more detail. But really, next slide, Zubaida. We're going to move on to the most interesting part of the webinar, where we're going to focus on the insights of implementing RMSs through 2 case studies. And next slide, Zubaida. So the first case study is going to be presented by Tim Frankenberger, the president of TANGO International. And Tim led an RMS in the Resilience in Sahel Enhanced initiative in Niger and Burkina Faso. And then we're also going to hear from Arno Bratz, who's currently the MEL director for the Apalu activity in northern Uganda with Mercy Corps, but was previously the MEL lead for the South Kivu Food Security Program in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And Arno is going to be presenting on embedding an RMS into FSP's farmer-based seasonal surveys. Next slide, please, Zubaida. So I'm going to turn it over to Tim to tell us about our first case study. And for any questions you might have during Tim's presentation or Arno's presentation, we'd like to ask you to use the Google form to submit those questions. And it looks like Maya has pasted the link to the chat right now. So you'll submit 1 question per form, and you can submit as many questions and as many times as you'd like, but we'd like to ask you to submit it through the form, so it'll help us sort of be able to monitor the questions a bit better than the chat. All right, so thank you, and I'm going to pass it over to Tim now.
Okay, thank you, Jill. So those of you may be familiar with the RISE program that's being implemented in Niger and Burkina Faso. The main goal of that program is to increase the resilience to shocks of chronically vulnerable populations in the agro-pastoral and marginal agricultural livelihood zones in the Sahel. So they're working in the regions of the Sahel, Central Nord and Est in Burkina, Tillabéri, Maradi, and Zinder in Niger. It was a 5-year program, and some of the program activities were extended 2 more years. But I think it was an attempt to try to monitor how shocks were unfolding in these 2 countries over time. Next slide. So the RISE program was trying to improve technologies and management practices around agricultural production, animal rearing, trying to improve people's access to markets and business development, trying to increase people's access to financial resources. They had disaster risk reduction activities going on, conflict mitigation as conflict continued to increase in some of these areas, and they had health and nutrition programs. The idea was to strengthen households' resilience capacities in these areas so that people could manage shocks more effectively. Next slide. So you can see that there was a baseline that was carried out in 2015, a midline was carried out in 2017, and then there were 5 rounds of the RMS that were carried out in 2018-19, and more recently, an end line has been carried out 2020. We're about we've about completed that analysis on the end line. One of the things that was critical, and Jill mentioned this, is that we had representative samples that was panel. So that means there was a subset of the baseline and midline that we were tracking, 828 households. And these rounds were about 2 months apart. So we were able to see how, not only how shocks were unfolding and how people were reacting to these shocks, but also how they were trying to manage these things and what was the negative effect on their well-being over time. We also had a qualitative component that was built into it, that we were actually surveying focus groups and key informant interviews, and these were collected concurrently with each of the quantitative rounds. Next slide, please. One of the things that came out very strongly in this RMS was that shock exposure had progressively increased over time. And in fact, so the risk environment in these 2 countries had actually gotten much worse over time. And they're not only environmental risks, particularly with regards to more flooding, but the negative effect on the economy, where prices were going up, people's ability to sell their animals, the terms of trade got worse, and conflict increased in both countries. And so what we're starting to see is people were starting to be displaced, and they were having trouble with their making a living in these both countries. Next slide, please. So it wasn't just drought that was affecting these people, but it was really excessive rains and flooding, and the lack of rain at critical times. So what's interesting about when you're tracking shocks over time is that you can actually have both happening at the same year. You know, we could have a drought event, or at least a lack of rain at critical growth times, and a flood event, which actually could wipe out a lot of the harvest that you were expecting. And so we use satellite imagery to kind of track some of these changes. And we had it at a good enough resolution that you could actually see differences between villages as how they were affected. Next slide. Conflict became much more serious as the surveys were being carried forward. So about the 3rd round of the RMS, we started seeing violent extremism becomes extremely significant, and that extremism and the conflict led to market disruptions. It led to school closures. It disrupted people's ability to work in their fields or move with their animals. It affected their off-farm employment opportunities, such as petty trade and gold panning. And it also hampered humanitarian assistance from reaching these people because it was very difficult because of chances of getting attacked on the roads. So people were becoming more desperate, and they were living in constant fear of being attacked. So everyone had to be very careful where they went and who they associated with. So they felt that things were very disruptive, and it made it very difficult to be resilient in such an environment. Next slide, please. So one of the big lessons learned here is that the RMS allowed us to understand how the operating environment, or the risk environment that people are working in, actually got worse. And many of the interventions that were designed to respond initially to drought may no longer be viable because of these changing risk. And what became very important was that the need for a shock responsive safety net probably grew over time, because it was very difficult for people to meet their needs the way that they currently were implementing their livelihoods. Next slide, please. But we do know that the resilience capacities that people possess did have a positive effect on their ability to manage some of these shocks. We see that this is a resilience capacity index the higher the index, the more likely they were able to manage these shocks. The lower the index, the worse off they were. Next slide. So the takeaways from this RMS said that we've got increasing shock exposure during the RISE programming. The four main shocks: climate events, army worms, violent extremism, and food price increases were getting worse. We did have about half, or a little bit more than half of the households were resilient to these shocks, but that was eroding over time. And what helped them recover were some of these key capacities, such as people's access to social capital, assets, savings, the informal safety nets that people relied on, having good human capital so you could diversify into different livelihood activities, better exposure to information for making better decisions, access to financial resources, access to markets, access to services and infrastructure. All of these had a positive effect on people's ability to manage these shocks and stresses. Next slide, please. So it told us that the RISE interventions were having a positive impact on people's ability to recover from shocks. It helped Niger households maintain stability in their food security in the face of drought. It reduced the negative impact of drought on Niger households and their ability to meet their food security needs. And it also reduced the negative impact of shocks in Burkina Faso, allowed them to maintain some of their food security. But what's important here is now that we've done the end line, we realize that this increase in the risk environment, the higher risks going through time, we're seeing more and more people displaced. We're seeing more and more people having to move in with other households in other villages, or going to the towns and cities as a way to manage the stress related to this conflict. So things have not gotten better. It's actually gotten worse in many of these places. Next slide, please. So this just demonstrates that, yes, strengthening people's ability to manage shocks through strengthening their capacities really helps, but there are limits. And I think one of the things that we take away from this RMS is that if you don't manage, or if you don't monitor the risk environment and how it changes, you've got to make adaptive management choices with regards to your program. You can't keep the design the same through time, because a lot of the factors that you designed your program around have changed. Next slide. So one of the things that we realized is that when you look at the number of households that were actually receiving some kind of a safety net assistance, it was not very high. It was like 10 to 15%, when it should have been much higher than that. We also noticed that a lot of the disaster risk management practices were more focused on drought and not floods, and floods had become more and more critical through time. We also know that violent extremism increased dramatically, so that made it very difficult for people to implement many of the interventions that people were trying to get them to adopt. And that even though savings groups were important for managing shocks and stresses, they were being negatively affected through time as well. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we learned from this is that localized information is really critical for determining whether or not you set up an RMS. If you rely only on national level data, maybe being collected by a national early warning system, it may not be nuanced enough to pick up on big differences in different locales that are experiencing these major shocks. And the early warning indicators for conflict affected households, one of the things that we found that was a really good early indicator was household size increases. When you notice that when people normally have 7 or 8 people in a household, and now they've got 15 or 20 people in the household, that's a pretty good idea that some people are getting displaced and being absorbed by other households, which means that things are not getting better. In terms of budgeting for these RMSs, a lot of it has to do with the money you have to be, how many rounds you can do. We find that it's been useful to do it every 2 months, but you can't always afford to do it every 2 months. So in places like Kenya and in Ethiopia, where we've set up similar RMSs, we've shifted to maybe 4 rounds of RMSs because it helps save a little bit of money. one of the big challenges that we found is when people are starting to get displaced because of the conflict, it's harder to track down those panel households. And so you start to lose some of your sample as a result of that. Also, when the COVID hit at the same time that conflict was increasing and flooding was becoming more important and these army worm attacks were serious, accessing these households or these communities was made difficult by COVID. And so we had to shift on some of our data collection from face-to-face to more virtual through phones. And then staff turnover also has a big effect on your ability to do these RMSs effectively. Next slide. So one of the things that we've learned, and we can share materials with you, the COVID-19 has led to many of the RMSs that we've been carrying out to be implemented virtually. For example, the rounds that we're doing in the highlands in Ethiopia, as well as the northern Kenya, we have done these surveys virtually. The other thing that we've realized is that it's really important to bring together implementing partners to review and reflect on the results as they're coming out to determine what adaptive management needs to be done and how to identify other kinds of information that you want to collect in next rounds of the data collection. We've also found that you might have to use a mixed strategy of in-person interviews and virtual where conflict has become more widespread. So on the fourth round that we're doing in the highlands of Ethiopia now, the Tigray region, which was dramatically affected by conflict, is probably, we still have access to phones and phone numbers for people in those areas. And so the fourth round will probably, in Tigray at least, be collected through these phone surveys. Whereas in the other regions where the RMS was being carried out, we still can do it face-to-face. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, I'm done.
All right, thanks, Tim. So I think we'll do a Q&A session right now, just to respond to some of the questions that have been coming in. And so this first question, I think, Tim, you can speak to this, and Arno, if you have any thoughts as well. Someone had said, I'm curious about the choice to do an RMS 2 months apart during RISE. And this part of the question could be for Arno or for Tim. What are the pros and cons of more frequent monitoring? So for example, every 2 months compared to annual or longer intervals?
So one of the things that we've noticed when you look at the kinds of shocks people are exposed to and how they're coping, collecting it every 2 months allowed us to see that there were different sets of shocks that people were dealing with, and their options for actually coping with that was very nuanced as a result of that. And so we think, okay, so just to give you a little background, when we first set up the RMS in the Prime project in Ethiopia, we were actually collecting data every month. And what we found was that was way too much. It was a burden on households. It was, in fact, when we went into some of the Somali households, the guy pulled out a gun and said, we're not doing any more interviews right now. And so I think you have to be sensitive to that. And so what we found was 2 months apart made a lot of sense. And in Kenya and in Ethiopia, we do it 3 months apart. So I think you want to do it maybe more than twice a year if you really have a increase in shocks that are going on. But if you're just embedding it into normal monitoring, twice a year is probably good enough. So I think it varies depending on what the context is and what you're actually trying to track. Arno, you might want to say something about that.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, I completely concur with what Tim has already been saying. I think one of the key considerations to keep in mind is, are we talking about sudden onset disasters where shock dynamics might be changing quite frequently, or are we rather talking about slow onset shocks and stresses that might not be time sensitive enough? If the latter is the case, then half yearly should usually be good enough. If it's a sudden onset shock, it will really depend on the specific context. So for instance, in the DRC context, in Mexico, we identified the border closure during COVID to be one of the key drivers of food insecurity. And so due to that happening, we saw a lot of downstream effects that happened quite quickly, such as militia movement, for instance. So in such cases, it might make sense to up the frequency. In other cases, it might make sense to just go down a little. The truth is, I would not be able to give you kind of an objective formula for this is how fast you got to do it, or that is the frequency. But usually, you know, if you have people on the ground and you understand, for instance, how market dynamics are developing and how security dynamics are developing, you might kind of get more of a sniffy feeling of what frequency would be appropriate. If you have to up the frequency, but there is no community buy-in, then you can still switch to lighter touch methods, such as, for instance, a smaller number of key informed interviews.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Right, great. So I'm just kind of scrolling through some of the questions now, and I think this question again could be for Arno or for Tim. So regarding making adaptive management choices, how can RMS and the analysis be made available to implementers in time to inform effective shock response? So maybe Tim, you can respond to that first, and then Arno, if that's all right.
So one of the issues, and many of you, it kind of depends on if you're setting up an impact evaluation for a large program like RISE, or maybe the development objective in the highlands in Ethiopia or the lowlands of Ethiopia, where you're actually trying to set up an impact evaluation for multiple projects that are being implemented in a layered way. Sometimes your ability to make data available more quickly can be hindered simply because you're covering more ground, you have a little bit more analysis, and there's more agreements that have to be made that now the state is ready to share. I think if you're collecting the data within a project, it's probably easier to get access to that information more quickly, and you can use it for decision-making much more quickly. So I think one of the things that we have to remember is that there are decisions for different purposes. One decision may have to do with how you're going to design the next program. Another decision might be this adaptive management decisions. And then third, you want to also understand, in the impact evaluation, we found that these kinds of interventions had the biggest impact. So going forward, those are the things that we really think we want to focus on. So there are different decision points in the cycle, and there are different aggregation levels that you're operating at. So how quickly you can share information for adaptive management can be influenced by that. Over.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with that. I would say that, as human beings, we are astonishing in that on the one hand, we have mastered more than any other animal to take in a lot of information. And number two, we've also mastered the science and art of not learning from it. So beyond the question of how fast information is available, I think one of the key questions is how willing is a team to actually take information, take it forward, and work with it. So if we see a team that is highly adaptable, that has high frequency check-ins or reflection moments, and that is able to actually implement adaptive decision-making, then there are possibilities to create automated data flows to enable high frequency of information coming in. So usually it's going to take you something between 1 and 4 weeks to set it up in the beginning, and then the information just kind of trickles in, and you have somebody clicking refresh every couple of weeks. So that is possible, and we did that in Congo. But we have to keep in mind that I think the question of how fast we can get information is only one half of it. And coming from the implementing partner side, I would say the unfiltered reality is often that we see a lot of information go into waste. So one thing that I think is very useful, if it's an externalized RMS, so one with contractors involved or contractors who manage between different implementing partners or agencies, is simply to ensure that everyone is aligned on what are actually the decisions we want to take and what are the information gaps associated with that. Having this clarity helps us to make sure that the data doesn't go into the void. Thank you.
Right. So I'm going to combine a couple questions here that are focused on some of the challenges with following up with participants and participant fatigue. And so can you, both speak to some of the challenges and solutions for, especially if you're following the same folks over time? And I know, Tim, you mentioned in your presentation that there was some large scale displacement, and how did you manage that with all the rounds and following people over time? And then also thinking about participant fatigue and kind of how we're coming back to the same households over and over again, and what are some of the strategies you have to reduce that if it's possible at all? So we'll again start with Tim and then move to Arno.
Okay, so one strategy we implemented was we didn't conduct key informant interviews and focus group interviews every round. Every other round we would do a key informant interview, then the following round we would do focus group. That way you weren't such a big burden on those households for the qualitative piece, and that made a big difference in terms of not wearing out our informants. The other thing that I think is critical here is when you know that conflict may affect the households that you're actually going to be surveying, it's important to oversample at the beginning so that you just take into account whether you're going to lose population as you go. So you want to make sure you have enough people that are in the sample that allows you to still do effective analysis. But if you lose too many, then it becomes very difficult to make the kinds of comparisons that are important for this stuff. And I saw Andre's comment. It's very true that we had a lot of discussion about whether we were going to implement this RMS, and it had a lot to do with, are the shocks and covariant shocks big enough to warrant an RMS or not? And I think what really became clear to us is that when we finally decided to go ahead and do it, once you get down to the local level, you find that the shocks are much more, certain locations are experiencing a lot more shocks than other locations that you might not be able to detect through national early warning systems. And so I think that was really a telling tale for us, is that once you got down there and we're actually doing the surveys, people were exposed to a wide range of shocks, and it was increasing dramatically. So I'm glad we did it. I think it helped us understand what was really happening in a changing risk environment. And I think that kind of information has been critical going forward.
Great. And Arno, do you have any quick thoughts on this one?
Quite honestly, Tim is the expert when it comes to incentives and strategies to prevent respondent fatigue. He's done that in dozens of countries. Just 3 very quick points. I think things you can do is, number 1, establish pre-existing relationships. Number 2, think about whether or not to do incentives. There are great guides from the World Bank Group on this as well, to see what amount of incentives is appropriate to not bias the answers of survey questions. So that is something that can be explored. And then number 3, in some cases, people might actually want to express their thoughts and feelings. In others, they don't. A good way to kind of test the ground is to check in with your staff members on the ground if you have any. So those are my 2 cents, but really I would not be able to get to this incredible amount of detail. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. So please continue to submit questions through the Google form. If I didn't get to your question, I'm actually going to continue just from the list up down as we start into the next section. But of course, after the webinar, we're going to be responding to the questions after the webinar as well, but just please feel free to keep putting questions in. So I'm now going to pass things over to Arno to talk about his experience implementing an RMS in FSP. So thank you, Arno.
Thank you so much, Jill. So hello again, everyone. As you know by now, my name is Arno Brands. I'm currently the Digital ML Director for Mercy Corps Uganda, but I've also been setting up and leading the implementation of the MEL system in Mercy Corps' development food security activity in South Kivu in Eastern DRC. I will be discussing today our lessons learned from implementing recurrent monitoring surveys. We will also talk about some of the things we've seen, but I would really like to put the emphasis on the process, given that during the initial call, we heard that many people are interested in understanding the concrete steps in establishing RMS a bit more closely. Specifically, from an implementer standpoint, there are some decisions that have to be made regarding the design of an RMS, the type of analysis that will come out of it. So I will be focusing on those, but I'm happy to adapt as needed based on the questions that are coming in. So quick information about the South Kivu Food Security Project. This is a Mercer-led DIFSA, resilience-focused DIFSA in Eastern DRC. An activity funded for 5 years by the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, valued at roughly 39 million. The South Kivu Food Security Project, on short FSP, is quite classic in that it is aiming at improving economic development, improving food security, and reducing malnutrition among children under 5. It's working across multiple sectors, 10 sectors overall, the main ones being agriculture, health, nutrition, WASH, governance, conflict resolution, youth, and gender. All of that with a resilience lens. Thank you. Next slide. Next slide, please. Perfect. Thank you. No, the one before. It seems like we have a bit of an internet lag over here in Uganda. I apologize. Great. Thank you. One thing that I have to make clear is that routine monitoring activities in FSP were pretty fast spread. So recurrent monitoring surveys were one of the things we were doing, but we were doing many other things, including resilience-oriented measurement initiatives. More precisely, we actually had 2 types of recurrent monitoring systems installed, one being a seasonal, the other one being a shock-triggered RMS. The seasonal was half yearly, so getting back to the previous question, we had more kind of slow onset or idiosyncratic or community level shocks occurring in our region, which is why we went for half yearly recurrent monitoring surveys, which we then complemented with mixed methods, particularly with focus groups, to then kind of dive into the soft underbelly of data. We focused mostly on agricultural shocks and stresses. However, once COVID hit, we also introduced a shock-triggered recurrent monitoring system that we embedded into the existing seasonal one. So we kind of started to up the frequency of our panel surveys and complemented them much more heavily with a comprehensive context monitoring system that was very heavy on key-informed interviews, particularly to prevent respondent fatigue, and also to give us fast enough, cheap information on the fly to assess where exactly we need to make what kinds of emergency adaptations. And in there, we focused much more on COVID-related shocks rather than just agricultural shocks. So COVID-related shocks included market shocks, health shocks, and security shocks, to give you a couple. And we focused on how these shocks affected community interrelationships. So how one community would react to another, how households and people in households would interact with each other, and how these interactions would change and what that meant for people's food insecurity. So for those of you who are more interested in the shock-triggered approach, we're linking you to other webinar links in here that we've held last year, in which we speak more to the shock-trigger component. Right now, I'm going to focus more on the seasonal component. Next slide, please. So as Jill said already, the guidance note 6 is extremely comprehensive, and it was a massive help for Mercer DRC to establish its RMS. However, it is not a step-by-step process. So there you go. This slide is supposed to kind of give you a quick overview of what were the main steps involved in establishing recurrent monitoring systems in the FSP project. You can basically just take the numbers 1 to 5 and then the bullet points, put them down in a list, and that's a good enough process. Probably not a perfect one, but a good starting point. And so when it comes to designing recurrent monitoring surveys into existing mail systems, from an implementer standpoint, we figured that the best way to go about it is not a Maserati technique, but a Fiat style, With that, I mean, we want to frame anticipated changes, identify information gaps, adapt mail strategies, and then tool and retool our existing mail tools. Based on that, we would then be able to kind of leverage RMS findings as part of the existing M&E system and then use that to analyze, learn, and adapt. So when it comes to framing anticipated changes, the key things you have to keep in mind, and this is really almost a copy-paste from impact evaluation literature and also from the RMS guidance note, it's important to understand who are the target participants, which ones are the outcomes of our interventions, what shocks and stresses might be intervening, what resilience capacities can participants leverage to bounce back from these, and what are the anticipated or existing interventions that actually help us move towards these resilience capacities. So if you're able to cover those, ideally in an integrated manner, that's going to make your life a lot easier than later when it comes to the analysis. For identifying the information gaps, it's extremely important to review what is the information in the mail system that we're still missing. So who needs to make what exact decision? What data would be required for that? So for instance, if we imagine that agricultural shocks pre-harvest or post-harvest could negatively impact the performance in agricultural sales, then let's define what are those shocks and how would the data look like, from where would we get it in order to then be able to adapt based on that. And so then we would compare that with the data we already have coming through either survey systems or routine monitoring systems, and start drafting a visual pitch. Kind of what would a visual look like that as a program director or manager will be able to take forward to then improve adaptive management. So when we have that, we move to adapting mail strategies. So there we look into what exact type of recurrent monitoring system would be appropriate to help us better track shocks, capacities, and longitudinal trajectories of shocks and capacities. So the first question, of course, is deciding on a seasonal or shock-triggered RMS. As I already said, we went for a seasonal one because agricultural shocks tend to happen all year round. So for cost reasons, we figured it would be much more appropriate for us to do it on a seasonal basis, which in South Kivu is on a 6-monthly basis. Then decide on the data collection strategy. In our case, we embedded it into the existing annual surveys, which was simply a cheap option, maximum cost of $40,000 US, but it comes with some definite disadvantages that I'm also going to touch base on in a few minutes. We then made sure to draft the RMS protocol and budget, and then based on that mobilized a strategy for the technological and the HR specifications to ensure that we have the resources in place that can help us implement the RMS. And when it comes to tooling and retooling, in some cases, you might actually want to draft a standalone RMS. For instance, if you want to base your RMS on population level tendencies, or if you want to integrate it into existing population level evaluations. But in some cases, it might actually be sufficient to go with participant level information, just kind of get more of a pulse than an ECG of shock trajectories. So if the latter is the case, you might want to retool existing tools. If the former is the case, you might have to create new standalone tools. Depending on that, of course, we have to adjust workflows. So in our case, that meant setting up kind of a sort of internal informal call center where specific staff would check in with key informants on a regular basis, and then amending the surveys, which would still be in person, given the rather low-key trajectory of COVID in South Kivu. And then lastly, once we have all of that in place and the data comes, starting to flow in, we need to make sure that we have an analysis plan in place, export, process, analyze the data, ideally in an automated manner, as we said before, and then present it in a management-friendly format. Based on that, we would then organize sense-making sessions at program decision-making gates, so that maybe on a weekly basis, when it comes to quick adaptations, do we need to do emergency distributions? Do we need to change, for instance, the quality assurance strategy for extension agents? Those are things that can be done fast. If there's a budget component to it, then it will have to be integrated with the, for instance, prep planning or the annual planning. And lastly, decide on adaptive actions, and very importantly, make sure we know who's supposed to do what, document it track it. That thing itself, can save us a lot of time, hassle, and also just make sure that we actually follow through. Thank you. Next slide. Great, so let's go through the steps. So first frame the anticipated changes, then identify information gaps, then adapt monitoring strategies, and lastly, tool and retool, fiat. So for framing in FSP for the seasonal shocks, we actually did a stress. Stress stands for Strategic Resilience Assessment. It's one of the methodologies used at Mercy Corps to identify key shocks at the onset of a program. And you can actually look up the guidance note number 1 of the resilience measurement series to take a look at the step-by-step introduction for how to do stress assessments. In FSP, we identified a range of 25 shocks at the onset of the program, and then we're able to structure those into what you see here, which we call the 6 storylines of shocks and stresses in FSP. I'm actually pleased to see that several people who were there during the beginning of the FSP program are also on the call today. So good job, guys. Thanks for being there. And the 6 storylines we identified were pests and plant diseases, soil degradation, multiple taxation, crop theft, land conflict, and waterborne diseases. So as you can see, beyond waterborne diseases, apart from that, actually, all of those shocks have an agricultural component to them, which is very powerful because it means that your choice for going for an RMS is actually very clear. We can go for a seasonal RMS, but beyond that, it also means that those shocks have immediate impacts or immediate effects on the financial value of production and sales. So that is something that we then leveraged when it came to tooling and retooling. Thank you. Next slide. So when we identified information gaps, going through who has to decide what information, what visual or what type of analysis would be needed to take that decision, and then what is the data we already have available, we were kind of stunned to identify that we had anecdotal evidence of high agricultural losses, but we had no time-sensitive information about what shocks hit farmers the worst and how much money they cost these farmers. So without wanting to dive into a cost-benefit analysis kind of framework, we would still have to see how would we know which types of shocks we need to address with the limited resources we have in our activity. How would we know which ones to prioritize, and how would we know if actually working on those shocks is a good investment? So not having this kind of information of how much farmers were actually losing, and how much that meant to them in their specific life world experience, that was kind of challenging for us. Second, we identified that resilient agriculture trainings, which were the main vehicle for preventing agricultural shocks in our case, were not geared towards the most useful and the least practiced techniques. So we were kind of, using really well-established training manuals, but not necessarily adapting them the most to what was actually needed and to what shocks were actually hitting people. And third, we identified that there was, at least initially, a quite low adoption rate of agricultural techniques and no real evidence about how well trainings improve technique adoption. Specifically, we were seeing that there hadn't been a significant uptake since the baseline at the end of year 2, and we were at roughly a probability of 45% on average of applying a technique after having been trained on it, which, for the targets we set for ourselves wasn't quite sufficient. So there you go. Those are 3 main information gaps. Number 1, we needed to know how much are people losing. Number 2, we needed to know how can we identify the techniques that we need to promote. And number 3, we had to know what is it that makes people better adopt agricultural techniques. Thank you. Next slide. So I know a lot of you will probably want to talk about the cost of implementing a recurrent monitoring system. And that is extremely important. However, we also have to keep it in context. In fact, there's a trade-off between cost and counterfactuals. The better you want to design your counterfactuals, the more you're going to move towards a quasi-experimental design, which is usually just going to cost a lot more money. Similarly, if you want to look into population level changes, that will also kind of drag you into more of a high cost RMS. If, however, you only want to look into what techniques are being adopted or what behaviors are changing, and if you want to look only into shock exposure at the participant level, you might go for a cheaper option. So the two options we identified when setting for our RMS were, number one, embedding it into annual surveys, and number two, having a standalone RMS that is either embedded with the baseline and final evaluation data, so kind of trying to leverage that panel data structure, or alternatively, that is standalone and still at the population level. So we went for the embedded annual surveys because what we were needing was we needed to identify how to improve the adoption of agricultural techniques among participants, and we needed to identify overall shock trajectories. But we did not need to attribute well-being outcomes based on resilience capacities to our own intervention. So that's a big if. If that's something you're looking into, then it's best to go at a population level and try to kind of integrate this with baseline and final evaluations, similar to what I believe has been done in RISE and also in PRIME, for instance. Regarding the cost, it's extremely difficult to put your finger on it, but in our case, we were able to get to $13.9 per respondent per survey. However, for key informant interviews and for remote interviews during COVID, we were actually able to turn it down to just $2 per respondent, which is simply the cost of the phone credit. The reason for that is that we toned down the number of respondents for key informant interviews only and for context monitoring, and then had our staff interview those. But of course, what is not included here is the opportunity cost. Namely the question, what would the staff be doing with that time otherwise if they were not able to actually do activities in the field? So just keep that in mind. Perfect. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to touch on this real quick, but in FSP, given that we needed to identify to the dollar value how much are people losing, we actually went out there and started standardizing local measurement units for agricultural production. So for agriculture-heavy programs, just keep in mind, oftentimes farmers are thinking in volumes measurement units, not in mass measurement units. So what that boils down to is that you're going to have kind of 1 cup being used as measurement in one context and a spoon or plate or another size of cup in another context. So we identified 17 local measurement units and standardized them into the international systems of units. And then based on that, we would actually start buying up fields and the production on those fields, harvest those, and then weigh the production in the different measurement units, then dry it, weigh it again, and create a standardized index of how much exactly is being produced. And then based on that, we started to test different question items to identify how to best help farmers recall, not just their production, but also the losses they made due to specific shocks. Thank you. Next slide. So let's talk adaptation. As I said previously, we had a quite low adoption rate for agricultural techniques. And we also saw that there have been pretty gigantic losses. So in 2019, we saw that actually 41% of the attainable agricultural production value was lost due to agricultural shocks pre and post harvest. We also identified that roughly 24% of these were preventable within the existing budget of the FSP program. And so we zoomed in on exactly the types of shocks that we thought we would be able to move the fastest on. And so those were pre-harvest pests, those were pre-harvest dry spills, and then post-harvest weight loss and rotting during agricultural storage. And we embedded specific program decisions to help us improve the attention of harvest. So for pre-harvest pests, that meant basically reducing the impacts of pests from $5.7 per farmer to $3.9 per farmer between April and September 2019. The way we did this was prioritizing biopesticide production manuals in our social and behavioral change messaging. We also scaled up the HIT approach, which is the Mercer Corps approach in Eastern DRC, and also in other countries that we use for improving the natural resource management in hilly areas with poor soil health. And lastly, we prioritize the construction of agricultural collection centers and in fact use the exact visual you're seeing here to advocate for those with local authorities so we would be able to implement those in time. Next slide. We also identified specific factors that promoted and inhibited the adoption of agricultural techniques through qualitative methods, and we designed a training versus adoption index that looked into the specific training modules and the techniques we wanted farmers to adopt that would help them respond to specifically the priority shocks. And then benchmarking that started to optimize the adoption rates. We achieved a 60% likelihood of farmers adopting one new agricultural technique for each module they were trained on in FY 2020, relative to just 45% in FY 2019. So that was largely due to the RMS and the qualitative complement. We also implemented quality monitoring checklists with producer organizations and farmer field schools to help actually organizations themselves monitor which techniques are being applied well or not so well in their specific context. Thank you. Next slide. As a result of this, we saw that overall, and that is suggestive evidence, that is to say we do not have clear-cut counterfactuals, particularly randomized counterfactuals, which is to say this is not an impact evaluation finding, but based on the triangulative evidence we had, we identified that the design and adaptations made in FSP contributed to a significant increased production and significant increase in sales of agricultural production. We further identified that the higher training exposure was associated with a higher adoption rate and that a higher technique adoption rate was also associated with lower shock exposure and a higher production value. So triangulating all of those together, we can say that the RMS for FSP has been a very, very good investment, as you can also see on the graphics to the right. If you look closely, you may see that the average value of sales per farmer decreased in FY 2020 relative to FY 2019. That is mostly associated with COVID, though we're still working on figuring out the exact details of what we can do to further optimize that curve. Thank you. Next slide. Great. So this is the last slide. Let's talk about lessons learned on embedding recurrent monitoring surveys into MEL systems. So as you can see, the FSP way of doing recurrent monitoring surveys was internal. So that is to say, we implemented it ourselves. And it's also one that was based on the sample of the annual surveys. And that comes with some great advantages, but also some huge disadvantages. Generally speaking, we can say that the recurrent monitoring survey in our case at a cost of roughly 40,000 per season for the seasonal one, at the maximum, so between 20 and 40,000, was a very good investment. The reason for that is that our teams were willing to prioritize and adapt intervention approaches based on the incoming data. We also saw that basically the more severe and the less well understood shocks were, the higher the expected value of the RMS. So particularly during COVID, at a time where information was changing pretty much every week, it was extremely useful for us to know what specific regulations are changing in terms of which villages we can access, what hygiene behaviors are not coming through, and how exactly agricultural producer groups are adapting to the crisis. That is where it paid off the most. We also see that RMS can yield very precise and more comparable shock and capacity measurements, and that the panel can actually be used to then up the frequency of surveys if a sudden onset shock hits. So that's a definite advantage. We should have to mention though, that overall there's a need to decide between low cost versus clear-cut counterfactuals, because keep in mind in FSP, while we can say what were the shock trajectories and what were the capacity trajectories of participants, we would not be able to tell you with clear counterfactual evidence whether or not FSP was really the one, the only one of the ones, or maybe not at all contributing to those changes. So just something to keep in mind there. Lastly, one thing we benefited from greatly was the automation of our survey analysis. So we created automated statistical scripts and also automated dashboards that we basically just had to refresh. So that is something that I would definitely recommend for teams that have to do RMS on a regular basis. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Arno. So we're going to move into another Q&A session with both you and Tim. And the first question, there is actually quite a few questions that we're focusing on how you determined your sampling frame. There are specific questions about how you came to the exact sample size. I don't think we're going to be able to get into that, but maybe we can talk about some of the considerations for sampling. So whether, geographic area, the intervention groups, or, Arno, you had to consider working within the existing sampling frame of your annual survey. So maybe just a couple of comments around lessons learned around developing your sampling frame specifically for the different types of RMSs that you have experience implementing. So maybe we can start with Arno, and then we'll pass it off to Tim.
Sure thing, thank you so much. So let's touch base on two things. Number one, sample size. Number two, sampling frames. Regarding the sample size, how do we determine that? We did power calculations. For anyone looking into doing panel surveys who also wants to look into statistical significant changes, just make sure that you understand how powerful your sample size is. So we did that with the key indicators, namely food insecurity, dietary diversity, and food quantity. But we also, of course, looked into agricultural production and sales per farmer as the key indicators that we wanted to track. And then based on that, did power calculations to then see what is the sample size. Luckily, in our case, the sample size was lower than the actual annual surveys. So in the 300s, which meant that we could actually just continue with a similar sampling size, slightly oversampling at the beginning to then account for attrition over time. Now, regarding the sampling frames, it depends a bit on which RMS in FSP we're talking about. For the seasonal RMS, we actually had a core group of farmers that would stay in the program. And those were farmers and producer organizations, because those were the ones we would continue to support from the beginning to the end of the program. So for those, in fact, the sampling frame is almost the same. We just have to keep in mind rolling registration mechanisms. So what that means is that some farmers will come, some farmers will leave. We took an educated guess, in our case, just saying for cost reasons, we actually continue with the annual farmer sample. So taking that sampling frame forward and then continuing for future cohorts. Obviously, that comes at a couple of trade-offs. Number one, the more replacement you see, the less representative our findings are going to be for the actual participants in a given year. So that is something to keep in mind for IPs who look into that kind of perspective. The other thing to keep in mind for sampling frames is, of course, that if you have agricultural shocks as the key shocks that you outline, you might want to go for a farmer sampling frame. If not, you might not. So for COVID, for instance, we took a village-specific clustering approach. So we looked into conducting interviews in all of the what's called the health areas in Eastern DRC, and then centered our sampling around those primary sampling units to make sure that we understand not just general tendencies, but regional differences in how participant communities were affected by COVID.
And Tim, any thoughts here?
You're on mute, Tim.
I said something really important, and then now I can't remember what I said. No. One of the things that was important about our RMSs is that we were actually sampling the counterfactuals as well. So we wanted to track both sets of populations. So where the interventions were being concentrated on the part of the program, and the areas that did not have serious concentration of interventions, so that we could make comparisons between the two groups over time. We wanted to, again, power kind of drove the way that the size of the sample, that we wanted to be able to do certain kind of statistical techniques. And one of the problems that I think a lot of people that don't understand sampling very well is that the more you disaggregate your data, the less likely you're going to be able to have valid comparisons, or, so you have to be upfront when you think about this. What are the real groups you want to compare? And that should drive your sampling frame, because if you're trying to disaggregate too much, then you look something that might actually be pretty important may not show up as important because your sample's just not big enough. So I think that's important to take into account, and you should get people, if you don't have those kinds of skills on your team, you need to probably bring in people to help you out on that. Over.
Great, thanks. So I know we got a little bit into the weeds there, so I'm wanting to kind of zoom us back out, and then to respond to this question here. How do you balance feasibility of collecting data? Sorry, the question just, oh, here we go. Collecting data, analysis, and use, and frequency. So how do you balance feasibility with frequency? How do you determine it's worth it to set up an RMS if you're facing strained bandwidth, capacity to handle data collection, analysis, reporting? For example, if there is a benefit to conducting one round of the survey to make cost benefit determination. So I think this question is really just like, how do you make those decisions of balancing the feasibility with frequency of the RMS, and determining really if it's worth it to kind of make that investment. So there's a big question to answer. So I thought maybe we can start again with Arno and then move to Tim.
Sure, thank you so much for the questions. It's actually, one of the things that is one of my private interests. For those of you who might not know it, I've moved to the NGO world only a couple of years ago, and it was in the private sector and public sector consulting before. And so one of the key questions we often ask is, what is the return on investment of research and development, or of applied research? Now, my answer is going to be unsatisfactory, I believe. You don't know. If you do research of any kind, or even just generic monitoring of any kind, you're taking a gamble. Your gamble is that you're going to find information that, if you adapt based on it, is going to be a good investment. But let me try to turn it around a little bit. If you look at the review of the 16 DIFSs that was conducted by Impel in late 2020, looking at Title II programs between 2015 and 2020, you will see that almost all DIFSs had issues with prioritizing the right interventions. All DIFSs had quality issues, and 14 out of 16 DIFSs did not have a clear-cut sustainability strategy. That to me points to clear lack of data, and some of these questions, particularly around, to a certain extent, the quality of implementation and, more importantly, prioritization, depending on what shocks you're facing, can be answered with an RMS. So rather than saying we should determine how much of an investment in RMS is worth it, I think we should probably first start from the hypothesis that maybe we're implementing very, very high-level DIFSs, and we might need more data to do so better. That being said, again, I would take more of a ground-truthing approach to the question of what is the frequency we need. One of the proxies we looked into was accessibility, so humanitarian access. If access decreases, we might need to have more information about when it will improve again. And second, market dynamics. If we see a sharp change in market dynamics, that could be a good indication for having to up the frequency of the RMS. Thank you, and over.
Yeah, do you want me to talk now on that? So one of the issues for us is, I think it has a lot to do with the risk environment, how often you survey these areas. If you have a lot of changes happening rapidly, you want to be able to pick up on that, because if you have too long of an interval between when you collect data, you may miss some of the big changes that actually led to livelihood changes that people made, or selling off their assets when they shouldn't have, or and so what's important is, if you've got a very dynamic risk environment, you probably should try to survey more often. The other thing that's important here is people are trying different ways to lower the cost, but also increase the frequency. And so I know that Cornell, my friend Mark Constance, and others have been experimenting with embedding an enumerator within villages so that you that enumerator is given a tablet and actually a small set of questions that they're monitoring over time, and they're able to kind of monitor that shock dynamic environment a lot more quickly than bringing in a big survey team and doing it every couple of months or every 3 months. So I think if there's an opportunity to kind of embed enumerators in villages, that can help a lot in terms of allowing you to kind of keep your finger on the pulse as things are changing. Another thing I think is important is we have in Bangladesh, we have an embedded RMS in the care program there, and what we have found is that that information is used very effectively in adaptive management, and so it's only done twice a year, again on a seasonal basis. And I think that as Arna has pointed out, there's a lot of really interesting kinds of analysis you can do if you're tracking these changes in shocks with regards to agriculture and how to respond to those things. And I think that I encourage projects to try to do more of that because I think it's really critical. But there's still going to be a bigger need for where we're trying to integrate and layer multiple projects in the same area, like RISE 2 is trying to do, or these like the Ethiopia mission is trying to do with regards to highland areas, geographically focused highland areas or lowland areas. Then you might think about maybe reducing the frequency of how often these things are done, but have it more capturing both the counterfactual and the implementation going on, so that you can see if the changes that are coming about are happening on their own or they're happening because of your project. So I think that there's no one answer, as Arno said. You kind of have to make your call on the basis of how many resources you got, what the capacities you have in terms of your own staff, and what your main objective or purpose of collecting the data is for. So we can't really give you do this all the time or do that all the time. You just have to base it on what makes sense in that particular context. Over.
All right, thanks, Tim. I think we have time for maybe one more question, or maybe even two, depending on where we get with this first question. But I wanted to focus your attention now on the question: how long does it take to do qualitative, quantitative analysis? What have you learned, and how does what have you learned around how to do this in a timely manner to inform programming more quickly? So lessons around using qualitative along with quantitative analysis with these RMSs. And let's start with Arno again and then move to Tim.
Thank you so much, Jill. And I cannot stress this enough. Oftentimes, most projects and most organizations I've seen have unfortunately under-budgeted and under-planned for qualitative methods. The qualitative methods will often tell you more about the processes and the granularities of what things are happening. But to get this idea of consensus and dissent in qualitative interviews, you have to invest time and effort. At the very least, kind of have simple analysis templates ready. Ideally have computer-assisted qualitative analysis on it, and so far there are no real shortcuts. So no AI-informed method would be able to give you these kind of granular details and this synthesis. Overall, when it comes to embedding quals and quants, I think the biggest question is what type of mixed methods do you want to do? Do you want to do triangulative, iterative, or complementary mixed methods? And depending on that, you will have to calculate with very different time frames. If you need to have information fast, my best bet would be do a key informed interview, leave a couple of questions open. If you want to go into deeper tendencies, for instance, how are shocks affecting people based on intersectional social vulnerabilities and those kinds of questions, that just requires a longer time frame. Concretely, in our case, the quickest turnaround we had for qualitative analysis was 2 weeks. The quickest turnaround we had for quantitative analysis was roughly 2 hours.
Yeah, I think Arna's correct. It kind of depends on the kind of information you're collecting and how soon you need to use it. The COVID, for example, when we embedded COVID questions into qualitative surveys that we were doing as part of the RMSs in both Kenya and in Ethiopia, we focused on trying to get that qualitative information analyzed as quickly as possible so that the partners in the mission could use that information as soon as possible. But some of the broader, socioeconomic trends and ways that people are adapting, it takes a little bit longer to do that analysis, I think. So I wouldn't necessarily say that, oh yeah, we can turn that around in 2 weeks necessarily. It may take a month or two to get access to that information, analyze it in a proper way so that it can be useful. So, but I totally support the notion that we need to have these mixed method approaches, because the qualitative often reveals things that are hard to capture in a quantitative survey, and particularly around conflict dynamics. And so I really support the notion that we continually collect this information, but be realistic about how fast we can turn around some of this information for decision making. So, I think there's no easy answer to that. It depends. Depends on how fast you need it, and whether you've got the resources to actually focus on that quickly. But I think we need to think about qualitative information in the same way we think about quantitative. Some of it needs a little bit more reflection when you're actually collecting the data and trying to understand what it really means. And that, I've always said that we often need some of our best researchers on the qualitative side, because those insights derived in these villages can be really critical for interpreting quantitative data, but also picking up on nuances that we maybe didn't understand, like, for example, what social capital really means to people, or what some of these more things like aspirations or agency are going to be harder to capture necessarily in a quantitative survey. So I think that both really have value, but we just need to be clear about how fast you can analyze it and what to use it for. Over.
Right. Thank you, Arno and Tim, for your presentations and for answering these questions. I'm now going to pass it off to Maya to close out the webinar.
Great. Thank you so much. It's time to wrap up. I want to thank Jill, Tim, and Arno for excellent presentations and interesting discussion. I want to thank all of you for taking time from your busy schedules to join us today. Before you log off, please help us improve future events by filling out a super brief evaluation survey. You'll find the link in the chat. And we will be sending out a follow-up email shortly with recordings and PowerPoint presentations in both English and French. We will also produce a Q&A document that answers questions posed during today's event. We're aware we didn't get to all of them. As a participant, you will receive this document in your email in the next few weeks, and we'll also post it on our webpage. So with that, thank you so much. If you want to turn on your video and wave goodbye, please do. Thank you for joining us. Stay in touch and have a wonderful rest of your day.